Right here? Right here. What's up, everybody? Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about crabgrass, the history of it, maybe some of the uses of it, how it really came to be, and why it is such a pain in the ass for all of us to deal with. So, let's go ahead and roll that intro.
What's up, everybody?
Now, I should start this video by saying I'm not going to be going into controls for crabgrass. That's something that you can find on my channel, as well as a plethora of others out there to talk about what you can apply to your particular turf type, how to use pre-emergence properly, and make sure that you don't have a severe crabgrass infestation. The couple of things I can tell you is it's important to make sure your irrigation is correct, that your lawn is thick, that you're mowing properly, and that you're feeding on the right schedule. Now that that's out of the way, we can get through the rest of it. All right, firstly, let's go ahead and establish what this species is and learn a little bit more about it. Now, if you're unfamiliar with crabgrass, good for you. Most people have to deal with it all through North America. It invades lawns, parks, park strips, cracks in the sidewalk, golf courses, you name it. It grows pretty much everywhere. It's a very well adapted grassy plant species. You should know that crabgrass is an annual, so the plant that you see growing right there this year is not the same one that's going to be growing there next year. However, it is very prolific at reproducing, so here is what that means to you. One single plant can produce up to 150,000 seeds. That is significant. Now, that doesn't mean that every single one of those seeds is going to grow, but I have been on lawns that it has looked that bad. So, the plant can also produce up to 700 tillers a year, anywhere between 150 and 700 as a matter of fact, so it is still going to be able to spread and move along through the ground if it is left unchecked. Now, the beauty of this particular grass is that it is highly adaptable. Now, that might not seem like a beauty to you, but to me it really is, because this isn't something that shows up and then turns your lawn bad. It actually is an indicator that you were already on a bad track, and now it has a place to grow. So you're looking at these areas that are going to be typically very sunny, very warm, very exposed. That's why you see it grow a lot along the sides of sidewalks or driveways where people get a little bit heavy-handed with their string trimmer and dig down into the soil and it starts to expose to the sun. Those seeds really need the warmth to grow. Now, crabgrass in and of itself is not necessarily a highly competitive plant, and really it's easy to control if you do have a thicker, more dense crop cover and you're really focusing on getting your turf extra thick. So the two species of crabgrass that we typically deal with in lawns in North America are going to be Digitaria sanguinalis, or we're going to be dealing with Digitaria iscarum. Those two species are hairy crabgrass or smooth crabgrass respectively. But really the history of crabgrass goes back way before it became a pest and a nuisance in the lawn. It actually has sort of rich and humble beginnings. Now, if we go all the way back to the Stone Age, they have found in maybe mortars and pestles or grinding stones or whatever, remnants of the seed of a particular kind of crabgrass, and it was being used as a nutritional source. It might have been just used as being picked off the husk and eaten. It actually was a fairly nutritive food, and now that didn't really change. Because this grass can grow in so many different areas, it became very easy to cultivate. Now, that worked all well and good for a certain amount of time, but there were some limitations on that, which I will get to in a minute. So let's fast forward a little bit, 1849. 1849, this can be considered the time where we gave birth to what would potentially become a nuisance weed on the lawn. The US Patent Office decided that crabgrass should be used as a forage crop because it is actually very nutritive. And now, even today, you can go through and look at studies from universities from around the country, around the world, that talk about the value of crabgrass as a grazing crop in the summertime for cattle. Now, the beauty of that is It comes on strong when the heat comes. When some of those other cooler season grasses are starting to decline, crabgrass is actually getting stronger, and it responds really well to fertility. So that's something that you should know and be careful about, is if you're overfeeding through the summertime and you have the potential to have any sort of crabgrass coming up, you are going to make it spread faster. It is going to be stronger because it does take in nutrition just like any other grass does. Well, let's back up. The American prairie. So here we have this western expansion. The patent office says this is a good thing to plant. It gets imported, it starts to be used. So the crabgrass that we see, what we love and we get to deal with on a daily basis, mainly came from Northern Europe. So this came in from Poland, from Germany, and it was imported over and used again to sort of plant out into these prairies and help with cattle and oxen and whatever else might be needing to graze out there. Now, it was also being cultivated as food at the time. So currently the crabgrass seed is actually still being used and eaten, and it's often referred to as Polish millet. So when it was first planted here, it was something that could be, again, cultivated throughout the summer because the seeds would keep coming on and it could be picked by hand. Well, as we sort of progressed into modern era and using machinery, things had to change a little bit. It was a little more complicated to harvest a crabgrass seed and use it as a viable grain or a flour than it would be to, say, use wheat. Wheat was pretty simple. It grew up tall, it was easier to harvest. That basically became more of a staple. So with the influx of wheat and corn across the plains, the crabgrass just became a nuisance, and maybe it was still in the fields for grazing, but it was just more of a problem crop at that point. Now, I bring up the point that it was hard to harvest by machine because many of you might understand and relate to this particular fact. You can mow over crabgrass and mow over crabgrass thinking that you're going to get the seed heads, and maybe you do it first, but because the plant is so adaptable, it starts to grow lower and more flat, and it can get out of the way of that machinery. It's like it is adapting on a daily basis to what we're trying to do to get rid of it because it is a survivor. So now here we have this grass that nobody loves anymore. It's been shoved to the side. It's not really being used for any sort of edible source now in North America, but it is still on other continents because, again, it is very nutritious and it is something that can grow in the worst environments. So this brings me kind of full circle into Fonio. Now, Fonio comes from Digitaria exilis, so that is something that is a sub-Saharan grain that is being grown in the worst conditions. It is harvested by hand, and again, it is super nutritive. So I decided to get some of that and actually play with it and see what it's all about. Now, the first thing that you're gonna notice about all of this is the grain size is so small. And if you recall, I said that a single plant can produce up to 150,000 seeds. So we're essentially eating that, but it's much smaller than, say, couscous. And honestly, the cooked consistency is a little kind of a hybrid blend between something like a couscous and grits almost. Now, it doesn't have the sweetness, it depends on who you are. It doesn't really have the sweetness of grits, that hominy, and it isn't as starchy as couscous is. So it really has its own identity as a hot or cold grain that you can eat. Now, I find it to be a little bit more earthy, not bland even like rice. It just has a bit more going for it, and it's very flexible. So I started playing with it in the house. I used the flour here. It works wonderfully. It's very similar to rice flour, so it can be kind of added into different things, basically making it a gluten-free source for those of you who are worried about that out there. And you can cook with it like anything else. Even breading and frying and using it light like tempura works pretty well with this particular flour. So me personally, with cooking, I find a lot of versatility in this particular plant. It's nothing that I'd ever even considered before, but I wanted to dig into it a little bit deeper. So in a minute, I'm gonna show you something that I prepared with it, and you can watch through that whole thing, and I'll talk you through it as well. One thing that I think is very important, and I think that everyone out there, and this is just my opinion, should really consider when they're doing battle with this particular very invasive grassy weed, okay? Take a step back. I've said this so many times. It's very important to just take a step back and look at the overall picture. What is happening in the area to which you are having this infestation? Why is it in this particular spot? Are you noticing that the grass is thinner? Is it historically thinner? Is this an area of the lawn where you've struggled in the past to try to get grass to fill in? Have you checked to see what's in the soil? Have you done a test? Have you looked to see what your nutrition really is in those areas? Because crabgrass needs nothing. That doesn't need it. It can get down into the soil, it's going to drive a root down, and it is going to establish itself and cover up that soil as fast as possible. Maybe you've heard me mention this before. There isn't a soil that does not want to be covered. So grass, whether it is something you planted and cultivated or whether it's invasive or natural, will cover the soil. It needs to protect the soil. It's trying to protect the soil. It's bringing fertility back into that soil as it dies and grows and recycles and dies again and just moves along. So you have to understand that in a lot of those spaces, you're seeing a visible representation of low fertility soil. That's really all that it is. Now, you don't necessarily want to be pumping fertility into it when you see that already there. This is something that needs to be part of your ongoing plan to make sure that you are taking care of your lawn system as a whole. As we go back in history with a lot of different plants, with species even of fish and wildlife and horses and cattle and all kinds of things, everything has been brought here. We have had massive migration from all around the world into North America and reestablish it as to things that we see as normal and common, when in reality, maybe it wasn't normal and common. This is just what happens as we begin to cultivate the land and change the landscape. So a lot of the time, we kind of have a give a mouse a cookie sort of thing. We're trying to fix one problem with something that sounds easy, and then suddenly we have a bigger problem. So that could be something that you could equate this to, that, you know, crabgrass was brought in for a reason and now it's a nuisance. But if we go back and really think about it and say, hey, there is a lot of viability in this plant, and the seeds on your crabgrass in your lawn are absolutely edible. So it is something that can still be harvested, it is something that can still be cultivated, and it is still something that can be used. It's just not as easy as some of these other crops that we deal with. Let's jump into the little fun of cooking with Fonio, and I just want to show you what I did and give you an opportunity, if you like to cook, to go try this stuff out, find it, use it. I think you'll really like it if you're into sort of food journeys. So for this, I actually decided to do a poke bowl. Now, I love poke. I think it's delicious. I make it a lot. I do it a bunch of different ways. And honestly, for me, it's more about the color, making sure you have a good quality fish in there, and then just having it be fun. So I tend to change it up. It's never the same way in my house, but I do make it on a regular basis, and I think it's absolutely wonderful. So finding this Fonio and using it as a substitution for rice was actually pretty fun, because it is different, and it did change the taste of the overall dish, and why not experiment with it? So the jalapeno that I'm using right now is actually from my sister's garden. That's something that she grew this summer. That's something that's had our product on it for many years, and she continues to put that in her garden and produces some awesome veggies. So that was going to be the first thing. The cucumber is not. Now that is just something that my kids enjoy, but so I'll get to a point of why this cucumber is in there here in a minute. So everything is getting chopped fairly small for this. Sometimes I do them larger and I match all the sizes to what I'm gonna cut the fish. It all sort of lines up the same. Now I used salmon for this. This was a wild caught, very good, nice and fatty. I thought it was gonna be a nice one to use for this. So that was what was going on this particular dish. Now, the couple of things I added on that are a little bit different. So I did use cherry tomatoes, which I really love. I always buy small tomatoes just because I like the flavor. Plus the color is deeper and it just looks better on there. And I'm trying to get a little bit of a balance here because I've got some spice coming from the jalapeno. I've got some neutral coolness from the cucumber. I'm trying to get a little sweet acidity coming from the tomatoes. And as you see this kind of build in, I'm trying to encompass a wide range of tastes in this particular dish. So the other thing that I used here is a little bit of asparagus. That's going to give it a little bit more of that nutty flavor. And then I also use these butternut squash spiral cut zoodles or noodles or boodles or whatever they call them anymore. And just to, again, to add a little color and to give it kind of just this little bit of sweetness to balance out. Simply on this, I didn't use a whole lot of seasonings. I tend to leave that up to the person who's going to eat it at the very end. So I like stuff spicy, which is why the jalapeno is in there, but then I usually tend to add some other things to it, but I don't want to kill all of the rest of the flavors on the initial dish. So cooking the Fonio itself is actually very simple. Same as you would do couscous or even like tabbouleh. You heat up the water. You do a little less than a 2-to-1 ratio with water to the actual grain. So this is 3/4 cup of Fonio into 2 cups of water. I put a little mirin in there as well so that it gives it a little bit of sweetness. And basically you heat it back up to a boil, cover that thing, let it sit, and you're done. So the other thing I like to do on this is I actually use the salmon skin and made those crispy. I really do enjoy it when it's cooked correctly. Otherwise, obviously you can toss that away, but I think it's a good thing to keep around to have that nice extra bit of crispness in there with this whole dish. I used lemon to get me a little bit of the sour, to put that down onto the salmon. It kind of sat, and it sort of coats the salmon up enough that it kind of works like ceviche, right? Where you get this sort of slightly cooked outside just because of the acidity of the lemon juice, and it makes the fish pop. So finally, just assembling everything, it's just sort of a tower. Now, the reason you can see that the Fonio is still a little bit hot, I put the cucumber down first to give it a barrier between the heat of that Fonio and the fish, because I don't really necessarily want that fish to cook at all. I don't want it to heat up too much on there, so that cucumber acts as a nice cool barrier between the two and absorbs some of that extra heat, and then just sort of pile and stack from there on out. So that's it. This was kind of a fun video to make for me. I thought it would be cool to just get this out there to you guys. So I want to just thank all of you for following along. For those of you that are new, welcome aboard. It's nice to have you. And I'll see you guys real soon. Later.